All right, students, welcome back again to yet another presentation about Vietnam. Today we are going to do what I call 28.2.3. So this is going to end kind of the 28.2 section, and we're going to discuss a little bit of how the United States changes the approach to Vietnam based upon elections. So I'll try to keep this one a little bit shorter than what I did yesterday, but I have no guarantees, but I'll do my best, okay? All right, so let's start off here. We're going to jump into the 1968 presidential election. Now, if you remember last time when we were looking at Lyndon Baines Johnson's presidency, LBJ's presidency, the quagmire of Vietnam basically ended his presidency. And so, because of that, he does not seek re-election, which opens up the door for having an uncontested presidential election, basically meaning for the first time you don't have an incumbent running, which usually creates kind of a rush to see who could become the next president of the United States. One of the things is that in the Democratic camp, there was kind of a split. One split was looking at continuing and supporting the Vietnam conflict and LBJ and Lyndon Johnson's approach to continually fight over there. And then there was a new rising anti-war element that was on the rise in the Democratic Party too. So you have kind of a split between those two sides of it, and you have two people that really come out as the leaders of pushing this movement on either side. So Humphrey, he was Lyndon Baines Johnson's vice president, so he was, of course, looking to continue on the ideas that Johnson had been pushing forward in Vietnam, and also his social and economic policies too. Then you have Robert Kennedy, who is John F. Kennedy's brother, who comes out and he starts to find himself more and pursuing more the anti-war position. And also he, again, very big on social changes too, and that's one of the things that he was looking at. I'm really pushing for is civil rights legislation too. And throughout the primary elections, basically primaries are where people run to see who gets to become the ultimate challenger in the presidential candidate. They were pretty close to each other. However, Robert was starting to pull ahead in some areas. In fact, one reason why people really like Robert Kennedy is that he reminded them really a lot of John F. Kennedy, and John F. Kennedy and Robert were really close. Robert was the Attorney General underneath JFK, and he had that kind of suave, smooth personality, his good looks. People just really associated him with JFK a lot too. During JFK's presidency, we didn't really cover this a lot, but they had this idea of what they called Camelot, and the feelings and the error that was brought into the presidency by JFK and Jackie. And so people saw Robert Kennedy as trying to bring back that idea of Camelot and the JFK era. So people really rally behind him. And his big things that he's looking at is unifying everybody in the country. The country is pretty fractured right now. The 60s, especially the mid to late 60s, were just really big on upheavals. There was a lot of rioting going on, lots of protests. I mean, America looked like it was almost coming apart at the seams. It was a pretty wild and dramatic time. So Robert Kennedy shows up and he's like, hey, you know what? I'm here as a unifier. Let's bring our country back together. And so he really was pushing those ideas of let's improve race relationships, let's improve civil rights on all fronts, let's bring everybody back together again and show that we're all Americans. That's kind of what his message is that he's presenting out here to the American population. So again, he's gaining a lot of popularity because of this. But right after the California primary, when he wins in June 1968, he goes to the Ambassador Hotel where he has his kind of campaign headquarters for California, and he's celebrating his victory. And because that means he's pretty much going to be able to clinch the Democratic nomination at this point. He's really close to it. And as he steps off the stage and he starts to walk towards the back, an Arab nationalist named Sirhan Sirhan pulls out a .22 caliber automatic pistol and he shoots Robert Kennedy 3 times. And Robert Kennedy drops and dies at the hospital. So he too, just like his brother, is assassinated. And people still to this day wonder why Sirhan does it, because at no point does really Robert show that he's like a hardcore pro-Israeli or Zionist or anything like that. And so with an Arab activist attacking him, it just seemed kind of out of the, it seemed abnormal is what it was. And Sirhan eventually says, well, I did it because I think he had pro-Israeli policies, and that's why I assassinated him. Sirhan was actually tried and convicted of the murder of Kennedy and was supposed to be executed, but then the Supreme Court ruled that executions were cruel and unusual, and he was placed on a life sentence instead. And so, kind of an interesting end to Sirhan, but really a tragic end to Robert Kennedy. It would have been really fascinating to see what could have come out of, say, a Robert Kennedy presidency, or even just him continuing on as a politician, because he's a fascinating person to look at. So what happens? Well, this throws the Democratic Convention into chaos. And there is a lot of problems at the 1968 Democratic Convention. It goes south really quickly. And because of this, what happens is now you just have Eugene McCarthy who shows up and Humphreys show up, and neither one of them is an overly popular candidate. And also you have a lot of radical elements on both sides of the Democratic Party that are trying to push their ideas and their positions forward. And large groups of anti-war activists and other individuals who have different social causes and social beliefs show up, and over 20,000 protesters show up. And the Chicago mayor and also elements within the Illinois state government decide that they really need to try to control this situation, because there was talk about massive disruptions, not just the sense of riots, but also people had threatened to poison the water supply of Chicago with LSD and other drugs. So there was some pretty big concerns about how out of control this could get. And so because of this, 12,000 police are deployed and 7,500 National Guard troops are called out to try to rein in this chaos that is building outside the Democratic National Convention. And it does turn to chaos. And it's all pretty much shown to everybody's living room live, as you see protesters facing off against police beating down protesters. It's just an ugly scene across the board. Inside, it wasn't much better. There was a lot of conflict, anger, fighting going on inside of who was going to take this nomination, who's going to become the candidate. And so just in general, the Democratic Party looked like it was in turmoil, which it was. In all honesty, it was in turmoil during this time frame because, again, you just lost Robert Kennedy to an assassin's bullet. So it's really hard to suddenly just drop who you were supporting because they were killed and then back somebody else in return. A lot of the problems, though, Humphreys is not anti-war enough. Eugene McCarthy, he was way too soft-spoken. And because of all these different things, though, it really just, there's no core element, and eventually Humphreys does manage to get out of the Democratic Convention with enough support that he becomes the Democratic nominee. Now, on the other hand, the Republican Convention's totally different direction. It's pretty quiet. Richard Nixon, who often he's referred to as Dick Nixon, so if you ever hear somebody say that, Richard did actually go by that quite a bit. That's why you'll hear certain terms like Tricky Dick and different terminology when referring to Richard Nixon. He takes the Republican nomination pretty easily. It's considered one of the greatest political comebacks in history, as he loses the Kennedy in 1960. He loses running for governor of California. He seems to be politically dead when he re-rises during 1968. And he shows up and he really pushes the idea that he is, in a world of chaos, that he's the law and order guy. Also, he pushes out what's called the Southern strategy, where he really looks at the Southern stronghold of the South that is Democratic for the most part, and really pushes to make inroads into the South and gain the South's electoral votes to move towards his favor. And the last thing that he brings up is this idea of what's called the silent majority, where you have all these riots and these loud voices on the extreme ends of either political party. He instead says, look, I'm talking to all the people that maintain the law, that work for a living, that, just want to live for their lives, and I want to take care of you guys. That's who I'm focused on taking care of. So he called them the silent majority. And one of the really fascinating things about the 1968 election compared to most elections in the 20th century is that you see three major candidates actually come out. So you have Nixon, then you have Wallace, who runs as an independent, and then you have Humphreys as the Democratic presidential candidate, all enter in. And Wallace surprisingly has a lot of support. He takes somewhere like 11% of the popular vote. And with that, though, it shows Humphreys and Nixon actually, they come pretty close when you look at the popular vote. They're about 500,000 votes apart from each other. But Nixon, really, because of his Southern strategy and Wallace's siphoning of votes away in the South, he ends up winning with a substantial electoral college victory. He may not have been close to taking it all, full-fledged with the popular vote, but he does really secure it with an electoral college victory. And so our next president after 1968 is Richard Nixon. So what was Richard Nixon like when it comes to these ideas, and also how was he a governor? How did he govern, and what was he looking at? Well, he's a complicated person. People lots of times look at one person on one party or another, and they really try to label him as, either, you're a hardcore Republican, so you believe in X, Y, and Z, or you're a hardcore Democrat, you believe in X, Y, and Z. Nixon kind of played into both realms. He's fairly moderate. And the thing is that he truly believed in some of the social programs that Johnson was pushing, and also back to FDR, some of his social views and policies. He also grew the government quite a bit, but then he also was conservative on, social issues too, that really played up to the base of the Republican Party. He does do things such as creating the Environmental Protection Agency to really try to clean up the environment around the United States, put limitations on what can be dumped or how much CO2 could be emitted into the air. So he looks at trying to correct some of those things. Another thing he does, which is not labeled directly on here, but he creates OSHA, the Occupation Safety and Health Administration, which really has made safer work environments for everybody to be in. So he does some really great things from a social front and also from a workers front, protecting people, and also an environmental front. He helps work on protecting the environment. Another thing is that he seeks very unique positions when it comes to foreign policy. He hires Harry Kissinger. Harry Kissinger really helps forge Nixon's foreign policy. And Kissinger, he becomes a mainstay in American presidential politics and advice and foreign policy for many, many years after this. When you probably, if you ever look him up, you'll see him for the last close to 40 years now on television talking about his policies and his ideas. One of the things also that he tries to do is he seeks to try to make the United States and China closer, tries to forge somewhat of a relationship instead of being distant enemies. And he does this because it's kind of a counteraction to the Soviet Union. Chinese and the Soviets have not been getting along for quite some time. And he feels that if he can get China to more side with the United States, maybe he wasn't under the mindset that, yes, China's going to convert to capitalism. He knows they're going to be communists. But he felt like if there was a Sino-Soviet split, then there would be problems along those borderlines, which there had been historically between the Soviet Union and China. In fact, there's a few times where they come really close to going to war with each other. And he knew if he created some of that tension, it would keep the Soviets pulled some of their forces over in Eastern Europe and have to move them down to China. So kind of an interesting strategy. And the last thing he tries to do is he tries to get out of Vietnam with an idea that he calls peace with honor. He just wants to get out. And he brings up some very unique strategies. His very first strategy is what's called Vietnamization. basically is twofold: to get Americans out and make sure that the South starts to fight their own war. He wants less and less Americans on the front lines. He wants America to really move back into an advisory role, and that Americans are no longer taking the mainstay of the brunt of the fighting anymore. And he does really great jobs in drawing down troops. In 1968, as you can see, a little over 500,000 American troops are over there. By 1970, there's only 1/3 of 1 million, and then by 1971, there's close to only a tenth, about 100,000 left. And one of the things, though, is he tries to do in order to remove Americans, servicemen, directly from ground combat danger, is he steps up air campaigns, and he pushes two of them. Both of them were, we'll talk about them in a minute. Sorry, I'll go back to that in just a second, okay? But he really pushes for bombing campaigns, and he starts striking the North very hard with his bombing campaigns in hopes that it brings the North to the table. Now, one of the things, though, that he does that is problematic is that there is a lot of material and men being moved down from along the Ho Chi Minh Trail and into Cambodia, and the North is hiding troops in there. So he decides that he's going to invade part of Cambodia, which is an independent country at this time, and he doesn't get congressional authorization. And while elements of it were effective, where they really rooted out the North Vietnamese from the territories and out of Cambodia and cut off vital supply lines, at the same time, one of the things is that it really collapsed the Cambodian government, and because of that, the entire country's government eventually falls apart. And the United States kind of puts in a puppet military government. However, it too fails, and eventually Cambodia is struck into a civil war where over 1/3 of their population is killed during that war. So Nixon really makes a mistake by destabilizing Cambodia, and this blows back on his presidency hard. You know, people are really upset about the pictures and the images and what occurs in Cambodia, which only further inflames student protests on campuses. And so on college campuses throughout the country, you see greater and greater anti-war protests growing. In fact, they get dangerous and they start getting violent. Some people start, like up in Kent State, there's an attack on like an ROTC building, which is lit on fire. You see clashes with police, between police and students, and eventually the National Guard is called in, and due to a bunch of unfortunate incidents between the two, somebody opens fire, and after everything's said and done, unfortunately, 4 college students are killed in the National Guard opening fire on them, which again inflames tensions further across the board when it happens throughout the rest of the country. Even in Jackson College in Mississippi, 2 more students are killed. These images are all being played on TV too. So this is truly an evolution of American society and how we view things, because everything now is being televised. We're all seeing it, and we're seeing it in real time. It's not like back in the day where you go to a movie theater and you'd see a newsreel about what happened 3 months ago. Now you're seeing it live and up front. Furthermore, bombings started becoming more frequent in the United States, where government buildings were attacked, military bases were attacked with bombs from anti-war protesters. And one thing that really hurt Nixon, too, was the release of the Pentagon Papers. And these were top secret documents leaked from the Pentagon. I believe it was to the New York Times, who then printed them. The interesting thing about the Pentagon Papers is they were really targeted. I mean, the true target would have been Johnson, because it really ends about 1965 of all the cover-ups and things that Johnson refused to report and tell the American people of what was really happening. But it really hit Nixon hard with how it was reported out. So Nixon takes a brunt of the attack of these Pentagon Papers being leaked out, even though much of what he was doing wasn't contained within the Pentagon Papers directly. But again, this further inflames anti-war tensions. Nixon continues to try to push the North back into the peace process. So he opens up what he calls Operation Linebacker, and he has Linebacker 1 and Linebacker 2. And really devastates the North. He hits military targets finally. He hits strategic reserve targets. He really punishes the North Koreans. He hits them harder than Johnson ever had. And this really wakes the North up to this could be a problem. This could completely decimate our ability to make war. Maybe it is time for us to come to the peace tables and negotiate. So linebacker 1 and 2 really is what pushes the North to seek peace. And so they sit down and they start to hammer out a peace accord and a peace agreement. So one of the things that they do, and Nixon, true to his promise to get America out of Vietnam, he brings our troop levels down by 72 to only 24,000 Americans. In 1973, the peace accord is signed and stating that America would fully withdraw its troops in 90 days. And then the South agreed to hold free and fair elections, which would include allowing Viet Cong candidates and also Viet Cong supporters to be able to vote in the elections. So Vietnam comes, well, the American side of the Vietnam War comes to a close here. However, Vietnam itself does not have the happy conclusion. Once America fully pulled out, the North and the South start violating the peace accords, and eventually in 1975, the South's government basically falls apart. The North comes in, and they take over what's known as the Fall of Saigon. The picture in the middle is probably one of the most famous pictures of the Fall of Saigon. Those are people who have been American supporters or backed by the American government, trying to escape the U.S. Embassy and crowding into what limited American helicopters that we had to pull them out of there. And so what ultimately happens is that the second longest American war ends. And the reason why we say second longest is because the wars that we're in right now, where we still have troops in Iraq and in Afghanistan, those are now the longest wars that Americas have been involved in. But up until that point, it had been Vietnam. And over 58,000 Americans lose their lives in this war. Many more are damaged and come home. And unlike in World War II, where they would come home to parades and things in their honor, instead these men were coming home called baby killers, child murderers, rapists, and spit upon. Many of them would take off their uniforms before they got off the airplane so they didn't have to suffer it. And so these people, often these veterans that come back from Vietnam, feel neglected and don't feel appreciated, and so it really mentally hurts them for a very long time. Also, this changes the way America really looks at war in the future and how the media plays a role in how wars are fought or how America approaches fighting wars going forward. All right, so that brings a conclusion to the war in Vietnam. Again, this is a little bit longer than I wanted it to be, but Vietnam, again, is very important, especially how it affects today's society. All right, so I'll see you tomorrow with our final section. What we're going to do is on Thursday, we are going to start our review, and then on Friday, we are going to test. So make sure you look at that map and you start studying that map and be prepared for the test on Friday. But I'll give you a nice review on Thursday too. All right, I'll see you tomorrow.